So I think this is the first TOC finals debate that we've analyzed before, right?
Yeah, believe so. Yeah, we still have to cover the other one at some point, but this is the first one.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were in this debate, so any thoughts you have at the outset before we dive right in?
Not really. Close round, very good round, but yeah, no immediate thoughts jump out other than the fact that I think the round gets sort of progressively closer and more confusing as it goes on. So we'll have to see how that gets borne out.
Cool. Well, I guess with that, we can dive in.
We indicate our first contention is Israel. The withdrawal of U.S. forces and the status quo has corresponded with the rise in Israeli tensions. Herald 20 confirms that the rising tensions between Israel and Iran are developing against the backdrop of U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East, making a clash imminent. There are three reasons why affirming would cause an all-out Israeli war. First is emboldening Israel's enemies. Auburn 19 writes that the American decision to disengage from Israel would embolden Iran and its proxies. Paula continues that U.S. withdrawal would allow Iran to have a freer hand to operate inside Iraq and ultimately in Israel's own frontiers. Second is causing an Israeli panic. Pollock writes that American withdrawal will make Israel feel obliged to increase its forays against terrorists inside Iraq, which would increase the risk of retaliation. Third is allowing for weapon smuggling. Shyman 11 explains that American forces act as a barrier of smuggling rockets into the West Bank to Hezbollah. Critically, Lapin 19 writes that allowing Hezbollah to acquire more rockets would boost their confidence and thus embolden them to take risks, ultimately culminating into conflict. For these three reasons, Ahram 20 concludes that should the U.S. withdraw its forces, Israel will find itself in a war. An Israeli war would be devastating, as Mornine finds that if Israel was ever devastated by any kind of war, it would retaliate against any actor, including Russian and European targets that threatened Israel in the past. Russia would respond with nuclear weapons, leading to a global nuclear war that kills billions. Our second contention is Bahrain. The Middle East Policy Council writes that Iran has embarked on a larger game of avoiding direct conflict with Bahrain for now. However, Iran has an incentive to take over Bahrain. Indeed, Al-Tamimi of Oxford College writes that the gradual takeover of Bahrain is crucial for Iran to recognize its ambitions of dominating the Persian Gulf. U.S. military presence has been key for preventing an Iranian standoff over Bahrain for two reasons. The first is halting a Shiite uprising. McDaniels 13 of Brookings writes that the United States has helped support Bahrain's Sunni government with its presence. However, McDaniels continues that were the U.S. to remove its forces, the Shia majority would have greater power. Unfortunately, Ronald 13 writes that a power grab by the Shia within Bahrain would cause an Iranization of the area that would quickly spread to Saudi Arabia. The second is deterring Iran's military. McDaniels 13 writes that the absence of a U.S. presence would create a power vacuum and eliminate the moderating effect of U.S. influence in any Bahraini crisis. Al-Tamimi of Oxford continues that the presence of the U.S. Navy off the coast of Bahrain has been critical in preventing an Iranian invasion. Unfortunately, Mandel 17 writes that if Iran takes over Bahrain, they'll use the opportunity to seize Saudi oil fields, escalating tensions in the region. Iranian confrontation would escalate, as Slackman 11 writes that any Iranian confrontation in Bahrain will lead to direct conflict with Saudi Arabia. The Washington Institute in 2011 warns that Bahrain is home to Saudi Arabia's supply of oil, and thus any crisis would quickly escalate into an international issue. France 24 finds in the past proxy wars, they've killed hundreds of thousands of people. Additionally, it could lead to nuke war. As AB 13 writes, an attack on Iran would escalate to a large-scale war. Russia and China would be drawn in with nuclear weapons, and they could be used by miscalculation, ultimately resulting in extinction. Our third contention is Saudi Arabia. Withdrawing from the Middle East would inflame tensions with Saudi Arabia for two key reasons. The first is panic. With our security in the region, Walsh 19 finds that Saudi Arabia has pursued negotiations in Yemen, resulting in easing tensions and drastic reductions in both airstrikes and casualties. Unfortunately, Pollock furthers that because our allies aren't as capable as we are and often over-exaggerate the Iranian threat, when the U.S. disengages from the Middle East, they overreact and worsen the situation when they try to take matters into their own hands. For example, Brands 18 writes that most of Saudi Arabia's wrongdoings like Yemen were motivated by the belief that the U.S. was leaving the Middle East. Stopping the next Yemen is important, as Lynch 19 quantifies that the Yemen war killed 233,000 people by the end of 2019 and would kill nearly 500,000 through 2022. Second is prolif. Saudi prolif is extremely unlikely right now. Kaczynski 13 writes that the American nuclear umbrella has remained preferable for Saudi Arabia over purchasing or pursuing any independent effort to obtain nuclear weapons. Tamini 13 gives the warrant, finding that proliferation attempts in the status quo will betray the U.S. and sacrifice our security that Riyadh desires to maintain. However, if we withdraw our security from the region, Crosby 19 finds that Saudi Arabia will work to obtain their own bomb either by purchasing one directly or paying scientists from another nuclear state to develop their program. Problematically, Edelman furthers that that emerging nuclear powers would not have second strike capabilities and could be forced to launch preemptive attacks. The authority to launch weapons will be in the hands of low-level commanders, and the risk of an accidental launch would be high. Ultimately, Star 14 concludes that the consequences of even a small nuclear war would cause extinction because it would blow a hole in the ozone layer. Overall, Goldenberg 18 explains that for the past 20 years, whenever the United States left the Middle East and massive problems reappear, they created political outcry that forced us to re-enter the region with even more resources in hopes of containing the problem. Thus, we're proud to negate.
So what I like about that case is it seems like it has three fairly diverse contentions, right? So like there's this argument about Israel, about, emboldenment. There's this Bahrain argument about sort of creating a separate Shiite area that allows Iran to get more influence. And then the Saudi argument is just entirely separate about freaking out the Saudis and making it so they proliferate, or do Yemen 2.0. I like how diversified this is, and also how the internal links on each of these contentions are separate. What are some of your thoughts, though?
Yeah, that's 100% accurate. I think the biggest strength in this case is how diversified it is, and also how difficult that makes the rebuttal speech, especially when you think about how the round evolves. This is the first constructive, right? And so, functionally, you have like four different contentions here almost. And so when you have a case that's like this diversified and has this many, well fleshed out argument, and then you have to deal with all that stuff in a second rebuttal, where you will only have probably between 2 and 3 minutes to respond to the case, definitely makes it a lot harder. So yeah, I think that this is an example of a team being really smart about putting together a dense and technical case. A lot of the time in PF, the instinct is to just, speak slow in the case and then go fast in the rebuttal, and then just have a normal two contention case because 2 is a nice number. This is certainly one of the teams that is pushing that is pushing in a more strategic direction as far as the substance debate is concerned, and yeah, that helped them out a lot in this round.
So obviously you debated in this round. What are you thinking after this case is read in terms of, okay, here's some of the weaknesses I can focus on?
Definitely thinking I have a lot of work to do. Besides that, one of the weaknesses is that I think that some of the impact scenarios could have been fleshed out a little better, particularly as far as the terminalization is concerned. So, for example, the Bahrain impact scenario, we just kind of go from they Saudi has some oil fields to everyone jumps in and there's a nuclear war. And then, of course, the general proxy wars impact, which, it's not a general proxy war you're linking into, right? It's a very specific escalation scenario. So I think that the construction of some of the impact scenarios leaves some vulnerabilities open.
Makes sense. Anything else you want to add before we move on to what comes next?
I think that's about it.
Cool. Let's keep going.
We can start now. Anyways, I've been waiting for 4 years to say this. For the last time ever, Contention 1 is Yemen. Hasbin 19 explains that benefiting from the U.S. security umbrella anchored by its bases around the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have attempted to organize the region through military interventions. They launched with U.S. support an ineffective war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. After America withdraws troops from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia no longer has a security umbrella that enables adventurism into Yemen. This will cause it to turn to a negotiated solution to the conflict, as current conditions are ripe for an agreement. Hanley of March 2020 explains that the war has been costly both in financial terms and in international reputation of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would agree to having the Houthis share in power with Saudi-supported Hadi government. This is true empirically. Parsi 20. Recognizing that the U.S. military was no longer at their disposal, Saudi Arabia began exercising their diplomatic options. Saudi Arabia stepped up direct talks with the Houthi rebels, and the level of violence declined as a result, with an 80% reduction in Saudi-led airstrikes. A power-sharing agreement is critical. Wiesman 18. The fighting and the blockade in particular have disrupted imports of food, fuel, and medical supplies, which is why Landry in 2019 concludes that the UN has described Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian emergency, with 10 million people on the brink of famine. Contention 2 is nuclear submarines. U.S. military presence in the Strait of Hormuz pushes Iran to develop nuclear subs. O'Connor 2020. The head of Iran's Navy call for nuclear submarines said that nuclear propulsion would deter and defend against the United States. He concludes that what creates insecurity in the Gulf is the presence of Americans. They have the capability. Weinthal 20. Nuclear propulsion submarines capability actually exists. Iran notified the IAEA that it was seeking naval nuclear propulsion, and Iran would beg, borrow, or steal technology. No checks on proliferation. So, nuclear subs give Iran plausible deniability. KEC 13. Nuclear submarines will allow Iran to deny ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons. It can take actions that put it remarkably close to a nuclear weapon while maintaining plausible deniability. The impact is accidents. Nuclear subs make accidents inevitable. Mian 19. Nuke subs' structural and characteristics pose unavoidable risk of accidents. Submarine nuclear reactors lead to ballistic missiles and warheads. Combination of failures result in devastating consequences that multiplies dramatically. Nuclear accidents could collapse marine biodiversity, which causes extinction. Schofield 14. The oceans are critical to human survival. Nutrient cycling represents a key repository of biological diversity and driving the global atmospheric system. Marine environments support key habitats and living resources. Contention 3 is a U.S.-Iran war. All right, I can slow down a little bit. Aggressive foreign policy has put America and Iran on a collision course. Coronavirus is making war in the Middle East even more likely. Germanos from April. Donald Trump threatened to attack Iran and make the country pay a heavy price. With a global pandemic and an economic collapse, Trump wants to add a major war into the mix. K in 2020 continues. Some in the administration seek to use COVID-19 to capitalize on Iran's increased vulnerability. Withdrawing troops from Iran's backyard reduces the probability of U.S.-Iran war for two reasons. The first is provoking Iran. Continued military presence risks miscalculation and provocation of Iran. Abido 20. U.S. fears of an imminent large-scale attack on its soldiers in Iraq is entirely valid. Iran seems ready to do whatever it takes to drive American troops out of the country immediately. The escalation by U.S. troops and the Iran-backed militias is putting Iraq at risk of an all-out military conflict. This trims down the possible scenarios for the U.S. future in Iraq to only two: all-out war or a departure sooner rather than later. Absent a U.S. threat of invasion, Iran will cease its escalatory actions. Trevino 13. While Iran has supported exporting Islamic revolution and Shia takeover of states, these actions do not create a network of offensive capabilities to become a hegemon. Instead, the focus of the new regime is survival, not expansion. Second is a shift to diplomacy. America's approach to Iran has been overwhelmingly informed by aggression. Jones 11 confirms that the challenge has for too long been treated almost entirely through the lens of security and militarism. Withdrawing troops sends a signal that the U.S. will shift to diplomacy, breaking the cycle of escalation. Harvard 19. Peaceful coexistence requires the will to talk and compromise. If either party shows reluctance, the region will continue to live with the possibility of war that could make all past wars look minor in comparison. U.S.-Iran war would be devastating. Chusodovsky 18. It would cause a nuclear holocaust over a large part of the Middle East and Central Asia, involving millions of civilian casualties. Even if nuclear weapons are not used, the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities using conventional weapons would contribute to unleashing a disaster with extensive radioactive fallout.
Cool. Okay, what do you think? Obviously, you know this case very well. What do you think some of the strengths and weaknesses are?
So this case is similarly diversified as the other case. So that's one strength. Another strength is the second contention, very squirrely contention. So it probably won't be that easy to respond to. Simultaneously, the weakness there in the second contention is that this is one of the contentions that we would just sort of like flex in and out to try and throw teams off by having some like weird squirrel argument. And so the warranting for the nuke sub, I think, is like a little sketchy. And also we weren't that great or experienced with defending this particular argument. So I'd say those are the strengths and weaknesses that come to mind.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the second contention, too. I was going to say something similar, that it seems like it's squirrely, it has the benefit of surprise and weirdness, and again, maybe these are my own biases, like my own knowledge of nuclear stuff creeping in, but it just seems like lie after lie, to be honest. Like, the idea that Iran is going to get nuke subs is not something that serious people are saying. The idea that nuke subs are accident-prone is something that serious people don't really say. Like, they're seen as the most stable leg of the triad. That it's just like every step of this contention just feels really a little bit sketchy. That I feel like smart analytics beat this.
That's very true.
And that is a lesson, I think, for viewers, that when there's a contention that seems a little sketchy, yes, you might not have a card, but their own cards can make the argument for you. Read the ununderlined parts of their cards. Make smart, logical arguments, because that's often sufficient to beat weird arguments. You not having a card on something is maybe a sign that it's really not something that a lot of people are saying in the literature. And that's for a reason.
Very true.
Cool. Other thoughts on this case?
No, I think that about covers it.
Cool. Let's keep moving forward.
Ready for cross?
Yeah. So on your first contention about Yemen, you read the Parsi evidence that says that U.S. withdrawal led to an 80% decrease in airstrikes. What did the United States do with troops in Syria at the same time?
I'm sure you're going to tell me.
They withdrew them, right? The fact of the matter is that having nearly all of our military presence there in the status quo allows us to do these limited withdrawals, which is what causes Saudi Arabia to go to the negotiating table in the first place.
Wait. Why, if the security guarantee is still there and Saudi Arabia sees the security guarantee is still there, then why would minimal withdrawals
No, because that's exactly our point, right? That bolsters our link story. Right. The fact that we still have our security.
There's a
The fact that we still have our security guarantee within the region is what allows us to have leverage over Saudi Arabia. Whenever we do these limited withdrawals of our security, that is what pushes Saudi Arabia to the negotiating table. That's what your Parsi evidence concludes.
I would say that the fact that we did that partial withdrawal and still had the troop security within the region and the airstrikes still went down by 80% only magnifies their impact and makes
it doesn't. It actually proves that we don't have to remove nearly. It proves that we don't have to remove nearly all of our military presence to get Saudi Arabia to do things that we want them to do. You can take a question.
Okay, sure. All right, whatever. So let's talk about your Bahrain argument with Shiite uprisings, right? So how many Shiites are living in Bahrain right now?
They have a Shiite majority country, and they're just led by the Sunnis.
Wait, they have a Shiite majority country. Did you read evidence that says that they have a Shiite majority country?
No, but you can wiki it. Can I have a question?
Okay, sure.
Cool. So on your second contention about nuclear submarines, does the United States have nuclear submarines?
Yeah.
Why hasn't a miscalc happened or an accident?
Because our nuclear submarines aren't in the Strait of Hormuz. Can I ask a question?
Wait, hold up. Why do they have to be in the Strait of Hormuz to have an accident?
Because that's where
like a tidal wave and then explode?
Yeah, because the Strait of Hormuz is, well, the Strait of, first of all, it doesn't, like, you don't have to do sub-bumping to have an accident, right? Second of all, we'd say that Iran is much more, or much less responsible.
There's tons of other things that could cause nuclear submarine accidents. Like, there could be like a massive
you would say the fact that there are a million countries plus a naval presence in a small region, which is the Strait of Hormuz, increase the probability of accidents, plus the fact that Iran will be a new nuclear.
Wait, we have nuclear submarines in the South China Sea, and there's definitely a ton of concentrated like ships.
South China Sea is much bigger than the Strait of Hormuz. Miles, can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So on Saudi Arabia, you say that you want to prevent the next Yemen. Where is the next Yemen?
I don't know. We'll see. Can I have a question?
Wait. If you don't know what your impact scenario is,
no, I can't predict where Iran's going to start its next war. I can just tell you that withdrawing our forces will provoke Iran to start its next war.
You don't need to predict specifically where. Can you just give me maybe a few options? Like a few.
I don't know.
Places.
Maybe Lebanon. I don't know. Can I have a question?
Lebanon. There's already Hezbollah's already in Lebanon. What do you?
Wait, but that's a terrorist group. That's a terrorist group. They're not like actively. Okay, Lebanon is destabilizing Lebanon to some extent, but I'm talking about them doing like full invasions or like starting multiple different.
So who do you think came out ahead in that cross-ex?
I honestly would say kind of leans towards Westlake. I think that he had some pretty darn good answers and some good quips to a couple questions, like the Shiite majority thing. But I think other than that, it's decently even crossbar. I thought it was a pretty good cross. A lot of key issues were covered, and they were covered in a pretty good, detailed fashion. I think both debaters come out, seeming pretty competent. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I think one somewhat relevant aside, I always find it interesting when people say, do you have a card on this, a card on that? Because a lot of the times you do need a card, but sometimes it's more borderline. For, a thing that's sort of just a straight factual issue. Yes, no, is this country majority Shiite or Sunni? Do you really need a card on that if you're saying something that a reasonable person could argue, is just something you should know? So, if you were to say, for example, the U.S. has, X number of people, do you need a card that says that? Or is that the type of thing you could just, Wikipedia? And I think that's always a thing that I sort of think about. So I thought that was a really interesting part of cross-ex too.
That's true. Yeah, I think that's the case. It's just like a demographic figure that, you don't really need a card on.
Yeah, because that's just a factual thing. That's not like someone's analysis or an expert asserting some esoteric empiric. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, cool. We'll keep going.
At the very top, a turn. The Pollock 20 indicates that all of our allies will panic were the U.S. to pull out, which outweighs their entire case on magnitude because every single one of our allies in the region, including Iran and including Saudi Arabia and other countries like that, start multiple conflicts across the entire region, which also includes the conflicts that they talk about. You turn it again because Irhan 16 finds that U.S. weakness in the Middle East causes the perception that we're going to be weak across the world, which causes other countries to not trust in our nuclear umbrella and independently proliferate, which increases the chance of conflict because nobody has second strike capabilities. So it increases the chance of conflict across the entire world, which outweighs on scope. Let's get to their particular first contention. 3 turns at the top. The first comes from the Walsh 20 evidence, which indicates that their Parsi evidence shows that we can leverage our military presence to do effective diplomacy. We don't need to do a complete plot. We can still have part of our presence in the area, and we can pull them out to leverage Saudi Arabia to do diplomacy. We don't need to do a whole plot. But second, you turn it again, because Tobin explains that leaving the Houthis just to be in the region by themselves when Saudi Arabia leaves would be comparatively worse because the Houthis would just fight the Yemeni government and cause more damage like they have done so in the past. But lastly, you turn it at the bottom. As Mabon explains that right now, MBS has a lot of domestic pressure on him to appear strong, and Tabati explains that most of his power relies on the U.S. presence. So if the U.S. presence were to disappear, he'd either A, become more desperate, or B, Ravik explains that he'd get overthrown, which increases tension to the region because a bunch of radicals fill in for the Saudi Arabian leadership. But lastly, on the internal link, Lamke finds that there's always an economic incentive for Houthis to continue to fight, and they're going to be like, oh, so the Houthis won't fight once Saudi Arabia has done diplomacy? No, they want to keep receiving aid from other countries, so they'll keep the crisis up. On their second contention, it's going to be analytics. This is a pretty cool argument. First, our presence is always there anyways, so they're always always going to have they're always going to be building nuclear submarines, because insofar as the hardliners in Iran always want to build these nuclear submarines, they're always going to do so. But second, they're building the nuclear submarines right now. There's no reason why they would suddenly stop once the U.S. leaves, insofar as they always have an incentive to project power against Saudi Arabia. But lastly, on the internal link, they don't read a reason why nuclear submarines exploding is just bad for people in general. They just say biodiversity. But Sagoff explains that we can lose 99.9% of our biodiversity, and there would be no impact on human life because we rely mainly on a few species that provide us all of our agriculture and stuff like that. So there's no reason biodiversity decreases is bad. But lastly, I don't really understand why the Strait of Hormuz is the only place that we can't have nuclear submarines. If nuclear submarines were going to explode every time they have ships around each other, then they should explode in every single other body of water that they exist in. This argument doesn't really make a ton of sense now that I think about it. On their third contention, on the uniqueness level, the Kiel 20 evidence indicates that COVID-19 has caused both Iran and the U.S. to look inwards instead of looking outwards, which means it actually decreases the chance of conflict. So don't let them tell you that now is the specific brink. But in the long term, the Economic Times 20 finds that Iran's main objective is regime survival. So they do whatever to accomplish that. So whenever they get to the brink of war, they stop before it goes over that brink. That's always what they've always done historically, and they're doing de-escalatory stuff right now, which proves. But Mahoney tells you to weigh this on probability. In 1988 and 2008, they always chosen to scale down and buy their time instead of starting an all-out conflict that would completely destroy the country as a whole. But onto their specific links. On their first link, 2 responses. The first comes from Horowitz. He explains that Iran is a very rational and controlled actor. They're not going to miscalculate. They've never done so in the past, and there's no degree to increase the degree of miscalculation that they tell you about. So there's no really way to terminalize this argument. But second, you turn this because Al explains that the U.S. believing emboldens Shia loyalists across the entire region, which strengthens both Iranian expansionism as well as, Shia loyalists across the rest of the region, which makes things more unstable, which means that you increase the chance that they miscalculate in the world in which you affirm. But on their last link about diplomacy, there's 3 responses. The first comes from Franson, which explains that right now, Iran, whenever they do quote-unquote diplomacy, they also continue to attack other countries, which proves that their diplomacy doesn't actually lead to long-term solvency. They just say that they're going to have some sort of regional agreement, but it doesn't actually manifest. But second, the Reuters evidence indicates that Iran themselves has said we're not going to get rid of these, we're not going to do diplomacy unless the U.S. gets rid of sanctions and rejoins the nuclear deal, as well as a lot of other stuff, such as they themselves tell you about presence. Insofar as the resolution asks us to get rid of nearly all, but not all, there's still going to be presence in the area. Insofar as the resolution says tell us not to get rid of sanctions, there's still going to be that stuff in the area, so they can't go to diplomacy. But at the bottom, you turn it again, because Stason explains that sanctions right now make it harder for Iran to fund both their military as well as proxies. But Polk explains that were the U.S. to pull out of Iraq, they'd be able to invade Iraq, get a ton of money from the oil fields there, and avoid sanctions because they have an increased capability to do war in the world in which you affirm.
I thought that was pretty good. I thought it was technically proficient, put out a lot of arguments, and I think it handled the second contention in particular appropriately. Didn't read cards, didn't really need to, just made some smart analytic arguments, but then really did drop the hammer more on contention 1, contention 2. So I overall thought it was pretty good. What do you think?
Yeah, certainly agree. This was an excellent rebuttal that was very difficult to respond to. I do think that one thing that was to our benefit is that I think a lot of the turns he reads border on the side of being underwarranted. I think that, yes, he's very efficient, but some of the times he's almost too efficient and moves on extremely quickly from arguments that could use a little bit more unpacking. I think, for example, the turn towards the bottom of the first contention. But besides that, I totally agree. I think the analytics on the C2 are very smart, and the quantity of arguments and particularly the amount of offense that gets generated for them in this rebuttal is very good. One thing that I'm also a little bit hesitant about is that the whole idea of going hard on we can solve these things without fully removing the true presence. I feel like to some extent there might be a debate to be had about whether or not that triggers their links too. If we still have some troops there, at what point does that not also trigger their argument? So I think that they kind of are treading on thin ice. You can definitely get away with it, but that's one wrinkle that was relevant to me.
Makes sense, and I think the point you make about under-warranting is fair. There's just this inherent trade-off between efficiency and warranting, and you need to find that middle ground. It's hard to find, where you're too efficient and the arguments are just not warranted, or you're inefficient and the arguments are warranted but maybe just too long, too fluffy. So it really is a difficult trade-off, and I think that on that spectrum, maybe the speech is too far in the direction of efficiency. But I certainly don't think the arguments were super unwarranted by any means.
Cool.
Keep on.
All right. So it's going to be, just our case, their case. All right. Is everyone ready?
start an allied panic. He concedes the partially empiric. We say that when we limit capabilities, that caused Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran to negotiate. Prefer this warranting because we say that yes, allies feel threatened, but their response is diplomacy. Partially outweighs his turn because they turn to diplomacy. He looks at the real empiric. That's how you evaluate the warranted debate. Then he says that like nuclear umbrella goes away. Firstly, I'll respond to impact D to like general nuclearization on their case. Secondly, no clarity of impact with other countries. Thirdly, that evidence assumes it's happening in the status quo. The own evidence is not unique itself. Then the first thing they say is we can do a partial withdrawal that prevents this from happening. Just because we can doesn't mean we will. And it's good to have a counterplay. Then they said that you can turn it and like the Houthis will keep fighting. And then the next turn also says that like Saudis become more extreme. For both of this, Lang explains that if we can prove that Saudi Arabia does turn to diplomacy, what ultimately happens is a power sharing agreement which incorporates all sides and leads to total solvency. Then they say that then on this like U.S. presence leads to them being overthrown. Firstly, this should have happened already if it was true that we were also withdrawing like troops, and secondly, it was never implicated. Also, Houthis want peace; they won't be hyper aggressive. Then on the second contention about subs, prefer our evidence over his analytics. O'Connor 19 is fantastic. He explains Iran views they're most vulnerable in this region, and specifically it is U.S. ships off this region that are causing the risk of this escalation. For that over his like empirics. The only thing he says is two things. First, he says why no accidents yet? It's because they're developing capabilities right now. That's the O'Connor evidence. Second thing he says is that we could lose 99.9% of our biodiversity. That's a random assertion. It doesn't interact what happens in this region. We say the collapse happens and human extinction still occurs. On the third contention, group his first three responses, the Abood evidence as of April postdates all of it and indicates that right now in Iraq there's escalation happening because of Iranian military presence, and there is direct proxy conflict between Iran and America. Then he says that Iran is rational. Yes, they are, and that's why they know U.S. presence in Iraq is an existential threat. Then he says turn it because you embolden it. Firstly, they don't give a warrant for why she is going to embolden. Secondly, that's just their case. Look at that one again in their case. Then we'll concede like diplomacy doesn't work because of like no U.S. presence. On the last turn, three responses. Firstly, they give no warrant for why Iran, or they don't explain how much more money Iran like gets from invading Iraq. Secondly, they could get money from like other sources. And thirdly, again, it's just the general emboldening Iran to be able to do that on their case. So let's go to their case. On the Israel scenario, first turn, U.S. presence emboldens Hezbollah. Quran 20 explains that Hezbollah vowed to end the U.S. military's presence in the Middle East, saying U.S. bases were all targets following the killings of Soleimani. Second turn, the affirmative solves better. Tisdall 2020 explains that U.S. regional troop drawdown would almost certainly be accompanied by a mutual defense treaty. Israel supporters in Congress would ensure the country was not abandoned. This requires no presence because it's just a treaty, which means we solve better. It also means Israel doesn't need to escalate because their safety is guaranteed in our world. Also, literally all their evidence is from like pro-Israel think tanks. That means way our turns over their case. On Bahrain. First turn, military support emboldened Saudi Arabia to invade smaller neighbors. Bazi 17 explains that Trump's unequivocal support has emboldened a newly assertive Saudi Arabia. Thanks to Trump, Saudi Arabia converts its smaller neighbors into submission. That outweighs because multiple countries get invaded because and that includes Qatar and Bahrain. Second, group all their warrants. They assume the U.S. is trying to deter. De-link them. Delaney 16 explains that Western countries sought to promote a political reconciliation between Bahrain's regime and the Shia population, but they abandoned those efforts because of the rise of ISIS. Third, the Tyndall 13 evidence is fantastic. It explains Iran is a defensive realist. This also applies to the turns they read on our case. This means that even if we withdraw our presence, all Iran seeks to do is protect its own borders. It will not escalate in response. That's the internal link into basically their whole case. On to Saudi Arabia, on subpoint A. First, they have no clarity of impact. They can't say where or when the next war is. Secondly, the ceasefire is failing. TRT of April 16th explains that Houthis violated the ceasefire 240 times. TRT explains non-compliance stems from Saudi refusal to make concessions and accept Houthi demands. That's why making Saudi Arabia willing to negotiate is key to solving a problem. Third, Jones explains that when the U.S. military encircles Iran, it forces them to escalate as they do to be no other option. That turns both links. Then on subpoint B, the first response comes from Esfandiary, who explains that Saudi Arabia can't nuclearize by themselves for two reasons. First, they have no technological capability; they're decades away, and secondly, they fear allied backlash. He continues, regional nations can't sell Saudi weapons because of massive retaliation. However, secondly, turn the argument, because the only way Saudi Arabia can nuclearize is with U.S. influence. Christopher 19 explains that the U.S. is using its influence in the region to sell Saudi Arabia nuclear weapons. The only risk of this scenario happens is if you broke that.
I think that my coverage on their case was, like, in terms of warranting stuff fully, better than the coverage on my own case. I think I might have tried to frontline a little bit too much in the speech. I think that, for the most part, we don't really drop anything, so we get away with it. But a lot of the front lines that I'm giving, they're not really, in my opinion, going the extra step of affirmatively disproving the argument. They're just kind of like doing enough to make sure that we have some ink on the flow to work with throughout the back half of the round. So I think that the biggest thing I should have worked on was my warranting in the front lines. I think that the coverage of the speech is very solid, and it makes sure that the first summary has like a bunch of stuff that it has to do. They have to extend defense on like a lot of different arguments, and they have to frontline a decent amount of stuff regardless of what they want to go for. So, yeah.
I think there are a couple of arguments that really stood out to me. I'm curious what you think is most important. I think one is this idea that, like, yes, maybe allies get scared, but the recourse is negotiations as opposed to, something more militaristic, which seems like it co-ops a decent amount of a decent amount of con offense. And then I think second is this idea that Iran is a defensive realist. I also think that is perhaps significant. Because that's just sort of a frame about how they make decisions. And I think those are two arguments that were, reasonably fast in the speech, but I can see becoming very important for the debate later. What else do you think really stands out?
Yeah, I think that about covers it, particularly the Iran being a defensive realist argument comes up and continues to be very important because it kind of frames the entirety of that very important Iran debate that subsumes a good half of the offense that gets made throughout the round. So I would agree. That's a pretty key point.
Cool. Yeah, let's keep going.
Miles, you need anything?
No, I should be good.
Are you sure?
I probably will call for stuff during prep, but for now I'm good.
Yeah.
All right. Jordy for Cross.
Yeah, sure.
All right, you can have the first question.
Okay, so I haven't received the evidence yet. Maybe that might clarify things up. But why would the U.S. sell Saudi Arabia a nuclear weapon?
It's basically Trump's political strategy, right? His whole approach to alliances is we don't want to basically be expending our own resources to care for them. That he wants self-sufficiency.
So
that's why he's asking NATO member states if I could.
Why doesn't he give? Okay, so he's asking.
This is actually a really useful.
He's asking NATO whether they're willing to give Saudi Arabia nukes. The important question is, have they?
What?
Have
Wait,
they?
what?
So is Saudi Arabia in possession?
Who said
of
he was
nukes?
asking NATO? No, hold on.
Okay, then
No,
let me
no,
ask
no.
you. Let me ask you
totally
more.
misunderstood the
Let
argument.
me ask you.
Hey, Jason,
more.
let me explain because you never let me finish my initial response.
Sure.
So I'm saying it is analogous to the situation where Trump asks NATO member countries to increase their own security commitments while he decreases, or not even decreases, just on face because he thinks we're doing too much for them.
Okay,
it's the same situation with Saudi Arabia.
The straightforward question is: so Saudi Arabia possesses nukes now, right?
No, they're on the path to development thanks to continued U.S. influence.
Oh, so we're not selling them nukes; we're selling them like nuclear technology.
Right, that is going to give them nukes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We're not handing them a nuke. I
thought from what you said in your response, it was they're selling nukes. So I thought I could hold it verbatim, but you can have.
Well, yeah, the evidence is actually pretty explicit. It's that
I'm sure it is.
The sales put the kingdom on track to develop nukes. So,
you can have.
I'd like a question though.
Sure,
so let's talk about your first contention. So specifically on Hezbollah.
Okay.
So how much of a change in the frequency of Hezbollah strikes is needed to trigger the impact scenario? Because they're happening right now.
We say an increase in the rate increases the chance of conflict. Like I don't know, like 5,
how
10,
much?
10 conflict. I don't know. Like you're asking me to quantify things that cannot be quantified. Like there's no one think tank that says like, oh, it would take 3.5 strikes to trigger war, right? Like
so you're missing the point. You're missing the point. What is the brink? Because the amount of attacks fluctuate from week to week.
I could ask
how do we know any
I could ask you what is
war?
the brink on all of your arguments. I could be like, how many nuclear submarines do they need?
How many?
Okay, so how many times do nuclear submarines have to be built to like, I guess, trigger a like complete collapse of like the Earth's like ecosphere?
It's not the amount of times they're building new nuclear.
So just like the moment they build the nuclear submarine, the Earth just collapses.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
The argument is this: it's O'Connor, as of 2020, says very recently what Iran is doing is they're venturing into using these nuclear submarines. So that's why it hasn't occurred
so what's
yet.
The brink?
Right? It's like a recent development.
Yeah, but what's the brink? The brink is like they immediately they nail in the last nail and then the Earth falls apart, or like they start the plan.
So you're also missing the point here. The brink is that as they start to deploy them, the risk of a miscalculation becomes completely inevitable. So yeah, it's a miscalc arc. Your first argument is not a miscalc arc, so you do kind of actually need to have a brink.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
How much time do we have left? I messed up my timer.
I've taken 120. So wait, isn't it our speech?
No, I mean in cross.
No, cross is over.
Oh.
Sorry, I was muted by the way. I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was relatively even on both sides. I think Jason was like kind of filibustering a little bit at the start of cross, so I think it was kind of good that I was able to get my point across there. Overall, yeah, I think it was a close back and forth crossfire. The whole nuclear technology debate is about the details of this one card, where it says that we are selling them nuclear technology that puts them on the path to development, but it doesn't straight up say we are handing them a nuclear weapon. So that's one nuance that gets explored further throughout the round.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it seems like there is a lot of focus on some of this sale of nuclear technology stuff that I wonder if that's just, maybe a mistake, or if that is really what the debate is going to really come down to, which is why there's so much of an emphasis on it. Do you think that's really going to be one of the main parts of the debate? Like, what do you think is the reason for that focus?
Oh, well, so the reason for the focus is that the most pertinent uniqueness question on the Saudi pro-lif argument is obviously, are they prolifing now, And so if this argument is true that, not only are they doing it, but America is aiding them, basically aiding them in that process, then that's, very helpful for us and makes it extremely difficult for them to win their version of that argument. So I think that, especially given the fact that we are both now trying to claim offense on the, Saudi prolif question, it's sort of up to them whether or not that becomes a pertinent issue in the round, depending on whether or not they decide to go for that contention.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. We'll keep going.
And doing some weighing. Cool. Is anybody not ready? There is one word in your RFD, and it's Walsh. They extend the empiric that says that after Saudi Arabia, after there's a pullout from the United States, there's an 80% decrease in airstrikes. Here's the thing. They can see that the reason why there was an 80% decrease in airstrikes is because the United States did a limited pullout from Syria. The only way we can do these limited pullouts to actually push Saudi Arabia to the negotiating tables by having U.S. military presence. Because once that bargaining chip is gone, because the United States has completely left the region, that is what emboldens Saudi Arabia to actually start conflicts in the first place, which means we get clean access to this turn. This outweighs them because we co-opt their empiric, and also if Saudi Arabia were to start this war, then it would cause regional instability, which would spill over into other conflicts, which means we outweigh. But even then, extend the Lamki evidence, which says, extend the Lamki evidence, which says that the Houthis always have an economic incentive to fight. So even if they do win their Yemen scenario, they're still not going to win any solvency because the Houthis always have an economic incentive to continue the fight. On their second contention about nuclear submarines, it's an absolutely terrible argument. The Segoff argument, the Segoff terminal defense goes unresponded to. They say it's a random assertion. No, Segoff says that almost every single species does not actually help out the United States in the first place, which is why he concludes that 99.9% of all species go extinct and nothing would happen. But second of all, the other piece of terminal defense that they drop is that the United States also has nuclear submarines within areas of close conflict, such as the South China Sea, yet we haven't seen an explosion, so they have no probability on this argument. Let's go to their third contention about U.S.-Iran war. Here's how you weigh this argument. You weigh it on probability, because the Mahone evidence indicates that the past 4 times that war is about to happen, Iran always scaled down. The reason why is Iran is a rational actor. They obviously don't want to get destroyed. What they're going to say is that now is a unique bright line. Remember, there were 4 times in the past where there was unique bright lines, but they always scaled down. They know their regime stability is the most important, so they're never going to start a conflict. You don't give them offense. Let's go to our case. On our first contention about Israel, it's really clean. They read 2 turns. The first turn says that U.S. presence has increased Hezbollah. Empirics disprove. Khalifah finds that right now Hezbollah is actually decreasing the status quo because the assassination of Soleimani caused them to lose legitimacy. On their second turn, they say the mutually defense treaty solves back. They don't prove any war as to why it solves better than U.S. presence. That's where you can extend our second link about panic. The Paul evidence says that without the U.S. in the region, Israel will become more aggressive, and they would increase retaliation in Iraq. That's crucial because our Laban evidence says that would cause Aharam evidence says that would cause a war, which will ultimately escalate into nuclear war, which causes extinction. This outweighs their case in 2 ways. The first is on time frame, because whenever the United States leaves the region, the perception that the United States has abandoned them triggers immediately, whereas their scenarios take a long time. But the second way is on a period. Whenever the perception happens, whenever Israel starts this nuclear war, it destroys all stability within the region, which means that they can't get access, and it also bolsters their war scenarios and causes war. On to our second contention. They read this turn from the Bossi thing that says Saudi Arabia will invade Bahrain. There's no incentive because the MEPC finds that right now Iran has avoided conflict within the region. On their thing about Iran is defensive only. 2 responses. First of all, Iran funds terrorist groups. Clearly, they're not defensive. But second of all, and also there's no way to isolate whether or not Iran's a defensive power. We would say they're escalatory insofar as there's no way to find who recently started a conflict. Onto our third contention about prolif. Cross-applied the second war on terminal defense as to why the U.S. couldn't get why Saudi Arabia.
I thought the coverage overall was pretty darn good. He's able to extend defense on, basically all of our open arguments that we could go for.
So each contention that is frontline and is relevant. But because we have so many positions that we could go for in rebuttal out of like offense and case, etc., he does have to spread himself very thin. So he's able to extend a really good amount of arguments quantitatively, but they're all sort of divided up between the different positions that we could go for. And that's the upside to being able to frontline like a lot of different positions coming out of the second rebuttal. The downside is that it can be hard to really warrant things as well as you want to in that speech. Another part of the speech that I thought was solid, I think the weighing was solid, but I think the weighing under the first contention could have been a little bit less flippy. It would have been useful if he could have spent a little bit more time on it, because I think he does go a little bit light on the warranting there. But overall, I thought it was a really good speech.
That'll make sense. I think also the thing you're realizing is that the debate gets smaller and smaller as it goes on, which is something for younger debaters especially to realize, that if there are 6 contentions total in play, 3 on each side, summary is not going to have 6. The debate is going to gradually get smaller, and I think this is a speech where it could have actually benefited from being even smaller. I'm not sure if they needed to extend both, like, contention 1, contention 2, that, like, maybe they could have really just consolidated even more to avoid the problem that you're discussing, Jack, about overextending, perhaps. That I think that, and I'm sure you'll see pro-summary also make the debate a little bit smaller. You'll see, them probably not going to go for every contention. Do you think that, how much smaller do you think the debate should become in the subsequent speech?
Yeah, I mean, I think judging by what was said, it doesn't seem to me like they fully like even have the door open to necessarily go for, I think was the C2. But yeah, I think that what will happen is that, we'll basically just start talking about 2 contentions rather than all of these different contentions. And yeah, it's definitely not to the summary's advantage to have to cover so many things quantitatively, like different issues.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let's see what happens.
Starts on my case. I'm going to read briefly on the Walsh chart, and I'll signpost from there. Is everyone ready? Start on the Walsh turn. In order for them to get offense on like negotiations and diplomacy in the status quo, they need to prove uniqueness that negotiations in the status quo are actually working in the diplomacy of solving conflict. Clearly not, because all the ceasefires have been violated in Yemen. The war in Yemen is literally still going. If they don't prove that diplomacy is solving in the status quo, that means they don't get access to it, even if they have it. We would say that the best way to cause like real diplomacy, because the U.S. like partial withdrawals aren't enough, is to do a full withdrawal to completely call Saudi Arabia on their bluff. There's no offense up here whatsoever. They need to prove that the diplomacy through the leverage is actually solving any problems in the status quo. They read no impact to ceasefires in Yemen. So let's talk about our contention 3, which is what we're going to go for. The Abdo evidence is really, really clear. It says that because Iran sees the United States presence in Iraq on their border as an existential threat, they will do literally, the card says, anything that possibly can to expel U.S. troops from the Iran, expel the troops from Iraq. The Abdo evidence says that will lead to a proxy conflict in Iraq, which eventually escalates to war between the U.S. and Iran. The Judasovsky evidence says that will lead to a nuclear strike. That their own case says nuclear war leads to extinction. The only response they have is that with this Maloney evidence, it says that the past 4 times they backed down. 4 responses. 1, we post-date the situation is definitely much different now given the recent escalation with Soleimani. 2nd, we would say that the trajectory makes conflict inevitable, even if it's not happening immediately right now, or even if the next small skirmish isn't going to do anything. The Abdo evidence still proves the trajectory. But 3rd, we would say that evidence says that Iran is geared towards self-preservation. We would say that them escalating to get the United States out of the region is them taking an act of self-preservation, because they believe that the U.S. that the self-preservation is not going to happen so far as the U.S. is in the region. But 4th, that evidence it's terrible. It gives literally no actual examples like they said it does. Let's weigh it in 2 ways. First, the time frame. The Abdo evidence says that this is literally about to happen. Second is on strength of link. Their link into their case is a perception link. Perception is entirely subjective. This is not subjective. Let's go to their case. Extend first the Tisdall evidence. They really mishandled it. Tisdall evidence says that in place of the United States physical military presence, they would sign a defense agreement with Israel, meaning that A, it extends the nuclear umbrella to Israel, and B, saying that the U.S. would redeploy to defend Israel. They respond by saying that we don't prove that it's no better solvency. We don't have to prove that it's better solvency. We have to prove that it is enough solvency. So far as Israel still has a security guarantee, that severs their link into Israel being aggressive. Next, let's extend the response that says that Iran is not going to be aggressive with Hezbollah because they are defensive realists. They respond with two two warrants. One, they say that they're funding terrorist groups. They're funding terrorist groups to hit back against the United States. Once the United States is gone, there's no need to fund terrorist groups. But second, they say that there's no way to isolate. There definitely is a way to isolate. You can look at all the different reasons and scenarios where Iran has lashed out, and has all been in the case against the United States. The tribunal evidence is fantastic. So far as that's true, Iran is not expanding with Hezbollah because they don't see that the United States or the West is a threat in the region anymore. And B, Israel is not going to expand because the TOC evidence means that they signed a mutual defense treaty. There's very little probability of this impact. Next on their time frame weighing, it doesn't make any sense. They don't prove why it's happening sooner. But second is on the prerequisite. We would say we both link it to conflict triggers conflict. It works the other way with ours too.
Cool. One thing I like about this, I really like the impact calculus that's being done here. I think that's really strong because I think that as the debate does get smaller, it's really going to come down to a couple of core questions about impact versus impact. And I think the speech does a very good job really setting some of that up, especially with some of this time frame, strength of link stuff early on in the speech. What do you think about some of the strengths and weaknesses of this speech?
Yes, that is very true. I would certainly say that one of the strengths is impact calc. I also think that he does pretty solid work extending the responses on their case, including the turn/cross-app of the Iran defensive realism thing and the mutual defense treaty stuff. I think that we do pretty solid work on their case in this speech, which is good. Overall, you have a pretty accurate take on what this speech is, because we really do have the benefit of being able to do a lot more impact calc because of the fact, like you said earlier, that we narrow the debate so much further in this speech, so we can focus more on really just fleshing out a couple of things.
So going into Final Focus and Grand Cross, how are you leaning overall? Do you think it's fairly tight? Do you think you're leaning one way or the other?
I think it's really tight. I think it's, pretty close to 50-50. I think it's hard to make a call after these two speeches where clearly there's a lot still left to resolve, because I think the full execution of the collapse only just now happened in this last speech.
Makes sense. I guess we'll see what happens.
So if our Israel scenario is contingent upon Israel starting the conflict, not Iran, does your defense that you read about Iran being a defensive power only apply?
Yes, it does apply, because the internal reasoning you say as to why they start the conflict is because Iran funds Hezbollah. We say the root cause of this foreign policy venturism is U.S. presence because they're defensive realists.
That's our third link. We're talking about our second link. Our second link says that absent the United States, Israel would panic and start a conflict, not Iran.
Yeah, no, I fully understand. They start a conflict with Iran because there is current escalation. That's what your card says.
The fact that Iran
you're not answering my question. The root question, though. My root question is: does your defense?
Wait, hold on. Here's the other thing, though. If we turn your third link, you still access your impact.
Wait, what?
The fact that Iran is a defensive realist and won't expand post-half means that Israel has no reason to feel threatened by Iran.
Wait, hold up. First of all,
the way that perception boils down in this room.
Also, it's about Israel's perception. Even if they think that, even if Iran's trajectory is to not expand in a post-U.S. world, Israel is still terrified of Iran. That's what triggers our link scenario.
But as soon as the AF happens, unless Israel like strikes Iran the day after we remove.
I mean, that's the way the argument works.
But does your evidence say that though? Does your card say that?
It says
where in the card does it say the day after they strike?
Well, no, it doesn't say that.
I looked at the evidence.
It's kind of wild how you're indicting our evidence in Grand Cross. But second of all, I would.
No. I'm saying there's no warrant for your time frame away.
We're indicting.
I do give you the warrant. The perception triggers immediately.
So, but again, you don't read evidence or any explanation as to why.
I mean, you don't contest that.
Evidence.
Yeah, we make the claim that time frame triggers immediately.
Hold on.
I'm looking at my flow right now. Our time frame says perception triggers immediately, and then you just go no.
Yeah. You need to have evidence that explains that right after they pull out, Israel strikes. Because just saying perception triggers immediately does not.
If you want to do an evidence indict in second file, that's fine. But
how is this an evidence indict? I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you can't just say that when perception exists, there is immediately a war. Guys, you're not letting me finish.
I don't know if we're getting anywhere right now.
We're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, y'all aren't letting me finish, but you can have a question.
You can finish.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that, yes, it might be true as a matter of concept that perceptions change immediately, but you don't read evidence saying that Israel then can mobilize its forces, can do this attack, or that there are like political forces that would like respond to this perception. There needs to be more work done.
Yeah. I didn't hear any of that defense in any other speech besides in Grand Cross, but that's fine. Y'all can take a question.
The defense was there was no warrant, and I'm saying why it matters, but that's fine.
No warrant, but that's fine.
Sure. So let's talk about the defense treaty, right? So far as we agree that the United States would sign a defense treaty with Israel, right? What more does the United States have to commit to doing in order to provide, or in order for Israel to feel secure? So long as the United States security agreement says that the U.S. will extend their nuclear umbrella and also will redeploy to defend Israel in the event of attack.
Here's the thing, that still doesn't interact with our warrant, right? Because Pollock says that even whenever the United States withdraws, Israel would still be scared. And the reason why is because we maintain forces in Iraq that make Israel feel more secure. A mutual defense treaty where there's no like actual backing to the treaty doesn't matter.
But you don't explain why there is a difference between the forces in Iraq and the ability to redeploy, right? The link into the like your perception.
Why would we need redeployment if we just have them there in the first place? Like, I'd feel more secure if it was just there than if it's like, okay, we'll be here in a little bit if something bad happens.
But like the time frame of like the United States taking like 3 days rather than 4 days to respond is definitely not enough to trigger the bright line between attacking.
I mean, mobilizing all the troops takes a little bit of time.
The United States taking a little bit extra time to mobilize their troops isn't going to be the difference maker as to whether or not Israel like starts a full scale war with Iran.
Huh? Sorry, you kind of just.
I think that's tough.
Okay, so like most Grand Crosses, that was sort of a lot going on all at once. I sort of view that as a stalemate. Like, I think everybody talked over everybody else. It was just sort of mayhem. What do you think, though? Am I wrong?
No, you're right about that. Like so many other Grand Crossfires I've had the joy in participating in, it's just kind of a cluster and everybody talking over everybody else. And nobody really gets anywhere. So, yeah, let that be a lesson to everyone watching what not to do. You know, try to rise above the fray in Grand Cross if that's even possible to do when there's 4 people all trying to speak at the same time.
Any takeaways or not really?
Not really. Nothing too much substantively other than the no warrant issue in terms of their impact scenario. That's pretty important because that sort of speaks to the like time frame debate on their side. So that's something that'll come up, I believe, in my final focus, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think that it's interesting. One thing worth remembering is that when you want to make a point that like no argument, or rather like, you know, the other team has not made this argument yet in the round, the last thing you want to do is to have a debate about that in Grand Crossfire, because now you give them a chance to actually explain themselves, and that's what you do not want to happen.
Yeah, that is really the issue when you give someone an extra speech inadvertently, kind of. Cool, we'll keep going.
In summary, yeah. So, is there anyone not ready? The Wallstrom gives us a way to win. It tells you that we can leverage our limited presence in order to solve for conflict. They themselves tell you that it decreased the conflict by 80%, which means this is one way in which we can already win the round if nothing else happens. On their third contention, they mishandled the Maloney States in the past in 1988, 2008, and now in 2020, they've always backed down. They make 4 responses. The first is about Soleimani. No, our economic times evidence already indicates that Soleimani was accounted for, and still there was no escalation. Next, they say that it takes time, but they're in the trajectory. This loses them the round, but I'll get to that later. Their third and fourth response are just how there's no examples and how it's escalation to self-preservation. No, they don't want to nuke themselves. They don't want to immediately lose the regime. And also, we have examples. We literally read all of them. On their weighing, their strength of link weighing is about perception. Their own case is also about perception. I don't get why they read it. On the time frame weighing, I'll respond to that later, but they don't read a warrant on why it happens immediately. On our case, the round breaks down simply. They extend one thing about the defensive agreement. First, Morgan does not extend a warrant in summary for why they suddenly give a security agreement to Israel, which means that you cannot evaluate it when Jack extends it in second final. But second, our time frame weighing takes care of this. Perception triggers immediately, while the defense agreement takes months or years to negotiate, which means that the perception triggers, which destroys the defense agreement because everything's turned into conflict already. But lastly, it does not interact with our warrant, just like my partner told you. In the past, like, even if we move our troops out, a piece of paper is not going to make them feel better. Let's get to the link chain. Right now, Pollock explains that Israel doesn't feel very aggressive, but that changes when they have the perception of the U.S. leaving, which means that they want to counter Iran more, which means they start the first strike, and Erhan tells you that leads to a nuclear war between Israel and Iran, which Star 14 tells you leads to extinction. On the weighing, they could see the second prereq that says that any conflict spills over. So whichever conflict happens first wins the round. This is where their third response about a trajectory on our case loses them the round. We tell you that the perception triggers immediately while their tensions have to continually build up, and we don't know when that will trigger. Insofar as they don't contest that perception triggers immediately, their responses at the bottom about how Iran is defensive doesn't matter. The moment Israel sees that we leave, they start a nuclear war with Iran. Insofar as they don't contest it, this conflict spills over. It makes their conflict non-unique, and it means that a defense treaty is far too late to stop anything. It's already one in the neck.
Okay, what do you think about that final focus?
I thought it was a pretty solid final focus. Overall, it was good. Don't think there was coverage on the defensive realism point in the final focus. I think that the weighing was decent, but I also think that he could have spent a little bit more time, like further developing the weighing and actually progressing it more than where it was after the summary speeches. But yeah, curious, do you agree? Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think that maybe there just could have been more weighing. Like, I feel like the time frame weighing thing sort of got kicked a little bit to the end of the speech. And that seems like it was a pretty big point of emphasis for the prior speech, so I think that could have been handled better. I 100% agree about the defensive realism point. That seems like it could be really a key frame about how these, actors make decisions. So I think that should have been emphasized more.
Definitely. The time frame weighing thing is that's another example of just sort of like the classic debate fact, which is that whatever you leave to the end of your speech on your flow/outline, you're not going to spend enough time on. So that's a classic thing, and it's one of the reasons why it's best to weigh earlier in the speech if it's around where you think weighing is critically important.
Yeah, you really do want to make sure you put the more important arguments first. It really is flow prioritization. Cool, we'll hear the pro final.
Is everyone ready? Starting their case, they cold drop the defensive realist turn and final focus. It automatically loses them the round. What our evidence indicates is Iran is solely defensive realist. The only way in which they expand the root cause for our evidence, we read that they totally conceded final focus is U.S. presence. This turns their links in two ways. A, Israel isn't stupid. They know that if Iran also backs down, they don't have to freak out. But B, it turns their third link. And that means that if we turn their third link, even though they didn't try to go for their third link, we still get their impact because we say that there's less funding in there is a drastic decrease in funding for Hezbollah, which means that we solve this conflict too. Again, Morgan implicates this into both the link they go for and also the other link. So we have a clear way that we win their impact. Even if you think they win the wing, we definitely just win the round right there. So let's go on to our case. Start by frontlining this turn he extends. First, there's no implication of it in final focus or extension of the warrants, so you don't weigh it at all. Second, they needed to prove that there was solvency right now with diplomatic negotiations. When we pulled out, that was one example. They don't prove that the impacts that are still happening. Again, they have no impact off of this. They don't cross-apply to anything super weak argument. At that point, extend the link. It's very clear. Abdo explains that Iran made a recent decision that it needs to expel all of the U.S. from Iraq, which is why there is current conflict happening between militias in the status quo, which eventually causes escalation to nuclear war. The one response they extend is just like Mahone all other times. Call for the card. It doesn't analyze a single other example. Moreover, Abdo is still better because it post-states for people. They concede that. Now onto the wing, which we're also winning, even though we don't have to because they dropped that turn on their case. First, on the perception, they drop this weighing in final focus. All he says is, your argument relies on perception too. No, it doesn't. Our argument relies on actual militarized crosses between the U.S. and Iran. What Morgan says is the perception links are systematically weaker because multiple uncontrollable factors influence perception, which means that short circuits their access to the time frame weighing, which means they don't access it. Secondly, even if you do look at time frame, for our time frame weighing, the Abdo evidence explains that we're on the brink right now. They have no evidence saying that the entire Israeli military could mobilize as soon as you vote for them to then cause the strike. That was a link chain they needed to make, they needed to prove, they never did.
Okay, what do you think about that last speech?
I honestly thought it was one of my better final focuses. I did the thing where I kind of started strategically with a clean, separate path of the ballot where I really blew up the turn, and I kind of made it seem even more offensive. And in addition to that, I think that the weighing goes pretty well in the speech. The whole perception link thing is kind of implicated as such as being okay, the perception dictates the understanding of the link debate, and then if they don't get the link, they don't get the impact, they don't get the weighing. So that question sort of comes first, the link weighing question. So I think that the weighing debate is handled well. I think that the first part of the speech is handled well. I thought that the line-by-line proper on our case could have been a little cleaner and potentially warranted a little bit better. But yeah, overall, I think that this is one of my better speeches. Certainly, I feel like it was a lot better than my rebuttal in this round, which I really wasn't too crazy about. But yeah, those are the two things that I thought probably won us the round.
I agree. I think that this is a good example of capitalizing on mistakes. The defensive realism thing wasn't really talked about in Con Final Focus, so that's really a huge, huge point of emphasis here at the top. It really sticks in the judge's mind. And then this perception argument. The Con only makes one argument. So then, of course, this Final Focus is just really beating down on that one argument, which then gives you access to a weighing argument that otherwise goes conceded. So I think the speech does a good job capitalizing on mistakes. So I guess just zooming out from the round as a whole, what are some of the major takeaways you see from this debate?
Yeah, few major takeaways. First of all, the more weighing you can do, the better. More weighing could have shifted the outcome of this round in the favor of our opponents if it had been introduced at any point. I think that one thing that winds up winning us this round is that the weighing done by them in a lot of cases is just sort of like going through the motions and getting good arguments executed as fast as humanly possible. But what you need to understand is that in a lot of these high level rounds, weighing can be the most important argument substantively. So if there's anything that you want to really spend a good amount of time warranting, it's weighing. So make sure that you're fully collapsing as early as you can, and make sure that you're not putting quantity over quality too much, because doing that, you can have amazing arguments, but sometimes you'll just be spread so thin that it'll be tough for you to ultimately come through and win the round. Yeah, I think those are my two biggest takeaways. What are your takeaways?
Big one I have is identifying pressure points and covering them thoroughly. Defensive realism in this debate is a pressure point. This perception argument is a pressure point. And I'm guessing a big reason why, you end up winning this debate is that I think your Final Focus does a better job identifying those pressure points than the Con Final Focus. That you can really, it becomes sometimes easy in these debates to miss the forest for the trees. You don't have to win every argument, but if you win the ones that matter the most, you come out ahead. And I think that before every speech, you need to think, what arguments will be determinative for this debate? And then you really just focus your energy on those, because you can use those then to frame out the other arguments.
Very true, very true. Yep, quantity matters, but quality certainly matters, particularly when you get into the final focuses. Makes sense to really just pick a couple of arguments and just spend a totally disproportionate amount of time on them, as long as you're giving ballot directive language and it's really clear to the judge why this wins you the round. If that's clear to the judge, then it really makes sense to spend a healthy amount of time on it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think that's most of what I have. So thank you for analyzing this debate with me, Jack. This was a great debate, and it's always a pleasure to watch one of your classic rounds.
Of course. Pleasure to have you analyze this with me. Hope everyone enjoyed. If you want more content like this, go over to our academy. We put out free courses that are excellent. Myself and Rafi, and also my partner Morgan, who is also featured in this debate, are all making some great content over there. So go check that out. Rafi, anything else you want to say before we close it out?
Nothing else. Thank you all for watching.